Morning, Chris, Cap in the Cap, Motolegends. Now, we're recording this very early June. In fact, today is June the 1st. Outside, it is absolutely glorious. It is scheduled to be the hottest day of the year so far. So there could not be a worse, less appropriate time to talk about the fogging up of helmet visors. But what the heck? We've decided that today's the day. We're going to talk to you about fogging, how to combat fogging, and as part of that, we're going to talk about, in particular, Pinlock visors. So the misting that we've all experienced on the inside of our visor in a motorcycle helmet is actually known as fogging. And what that is, it's condensation depositing on the visor. And what you see, that greyness that you see, is actually millions and millions of tiny little droplets of water. So what happens is your warm air from your mouth, your breath, moist air, when it comes into contact with the visor cools that air down and turns it from a gas, a vapor or gas, into a liquid. Now, ironically, one of the problems is that when it turns from gas into a liquid, that requires energy, and that energy actually generates even more heat. So that's why when you're breathing out and it's cold outside, it gets too hot inside, it creates that condensation, it creates that fogging. Just as an example, what we've done, we've put a visor into the fridge. We're going to pull it out now. I'm going to put it on the helmet, and we're going to see how that works. Graham? So as I've said, the visor is cold. I'm going to pull it down, I'm going to breathe normally, and we'll see if it fogs up. So hopefully that demonstrates the point. Cold visor, hot breath, condensation. You tend not to get this in weather like we're experiencing now, because in summer, the differential between your warm, moist breath and the temperature outside is less. So for fogging to occur, for that condensation to occur, it needs this differentials of temperature. Of course, when it's colder, it gets even worse. And what you have to factor in is also the wind chill factor. So let's say you're riding along at 60 miles an hour, it's 2 degrees outside, but at 60 miles an hour, the wind chill effect turns that into a temperature of -8 degrees. So that is pretty cold. This visor was cold. It's been in the fridge, not in the freezer. It was nowhere near -8. But you can imagine the situation if you're breathing and you've got a temperature outside that's -8. Now, there are other contributory factors that make the situation worse. Better helmets. Ironically, better helmets like this are worse. And they're worse because the better quality helmets tend to be better sealed. So on a good helmet, you will have a rubber seal around the visor to stop air coming in, to keep it quiet. You will have a good seal around the neck. You'll have a tight neck roll. You will have something like a chin curtain. The worst helmets of the lot, and again, ironically, are flip lids, because flip lids are known for being quiet, and that's because the way you wear them, you can have a particularly tight neck roll. So there is nothing worse for fogging than a flip lid, and that means that you have to find the very best solution if you're going to ride in a flip lid. The individual, the rider himself or herself, can also make a contribution. So if you're someone who is naturally ruddy-faced, or if you're someone who runs hot, that will make the situation worse. If you wear a helmet that is too tight, so it's pushing on you, your skin is being pushed out, your skin cannot breathe, blood is going to come to the surface, that's going to generate heat, and that's just going to make the situation worse again. Ironically, of course, in this context, cheaper helmets are better, because you will not have often much of a seal between the helmet and the visor. You won't have a chin curtain. The tolerances are going to be less. You might have permanently open vents. So if you've got a helmet like that permanently is noisy, that permanently has air coming in, that is not going to fog as much. I'm not suggesting that the solution to this is to ride in the cheap helmets. There are solutions out there that we're going to come and talk about, but I'm just letting you know that when you spend more on a more expensive helmet, you don't overcome fogging, you actually potentially make the situation worse. So we've all experienced, I'm sure, that situation where you come down to the car on a winter's morning, car is covered in frost. You get in the car, worse if there's a passenger, but as you start breathing, as you start generating heat inside the car, the windscreen mists up. So that is the same phenomenon that we're talking about with a motorcycle visor, it mists up. But in a car, it's very easy. You just put on the demisting function. And what the demisting function does, it blows hot air over the windscreen. So what that is doing, as we've been discussing, is it reduces the differential. So you've got your hot breath, the body's generating heat, you've got a cold windscreen, but by making the windscreen warmer, you reduce the differential and that misting, that fogging disappears. But it's not as easy on a motorcycle because, of course, we do not have an anti-misting function. Now, a heated visor would solve the problem, and there have been attempts to create heated visors, but there are issues with them. You would have to be able to adjust the temperature, you'd have to have a wire and so on, so they haven't really worked. But they do exist in snowmobiling. So you can imagine that if you're somewhere in Scandinavia, out in furiously cold temperatures, you're working hard on the snowmobile, the differential is going to be enormous. So in snowmobiling, that technology does exist. Now, the simplest solution, and it's what motorcyclists did for the first 15 or 20 years of full-face helmets. If you're riding along and the helmet mists up, the ultimate solution, the easiest solution in a way, you just open the visor. And what that does, that sends a blast of cold air in, it gets rid of the warm, moist air, equalizes the temperature, you put it down and the visor is clear. The problem is, it's kind of a temporary fix because 5 minutes down the road, it's going to happen again. But as I say, for many years, that was the solution. Now, these days, the better solution is, because we have more sophisticated helmets with better venting, what you need to do is open both vents. When you open the chin vent, that's going to allow cold air to come into the helmet. You then need to make sure that you've also opened the brow vent, because what the brow vent is doing, the brow vent is sucking air out. So as this cold air comes in, the brow vent is pulling it through the helmet, pulling it out the back, so it's increasing the airflow, because air that is flowing fast is not moist, so you've got cold air coming in, it pulls it out, and in many situations that is going to be enough. Now, the other thing that we always used to have was an anti-fog treatment, and the most famous I remember was Bob Heath's anti-fog spray. I don't know whether it still exists, I'm sure it does, but that works pretty well. For me, because I was never a heavy winter commuter, I used to use just Fairy Liquid. You would just wash the visor on the inside and the outside with Fairy Liquid. That would give it a coating. And for the kind of riding I was doing, which was mainly summer riding, I've got to say, that was always sufficient. But the other thing that is beginning to happen now, helmet visor coatings are getting much better. So we are beginning to see some coatings on visors now that are much better. But I still have to say that if you ride long enough and the conditions are cold enough, even the best coated visors are going to eventually be overcome. They will start to fog. Now, the ultimate solution, given the technology that we have today, it's not the perfect solution, but the best solution we have these days is the fitting of what we call an anti-fog insert or visor. So having said I'm going to be talking about anti-fog inserts, really I'm going to be talking about Pinlock, because in our view, Pinlocks are the best. Pinlock is just a brand name, but in our experience, they give you the best solution or the best opportunity to combat fogging issues. Now, I'm going to get lots of hate mail for that. People are going to write on YouTube that I clearly don't know what I'm on about, that I've never ridden a motorcycle, that they've been riding for 30 years with a non-Pinlock insert and it's never let them down. And I suppose there is a scenario where, depending on the bike you ride, the kind of riding you're doing, and so on, that you could get away without it. But in our experience, Pinlocks are just better. A couple of years ago, Schuberth, the German helmet manufacturer, decided that they could save a couple of bucks. They fitted a look-alike Pinlock into one of their helmets. It did not work. It caused them severe embarrassment. And my view is that Schuberth, of all people, should know better, or should have known better, because they make some of the quietest helmets on the market. And they're quiet because they stop the incoming air reaching the helmet. So they fit. Their flip lids in particular fit very tightly on the neck roll, chin curtains, all of those things. Stops air coming in, keeps them quiet. But when you do that, you A, stop cold air coming in, which would alleviate the situation, but you stop the hot breath escaping. So Schuberth make helmets that are always going to be more prone to fogging, but that means that they just need always the best solution, and fitting a cheaper Pinlock look-alike was a mistake. I think they learnt their lesson. Now, let's talk about the Pinlock itself, how it works. One of the benefits of a real Pinlock over a look-alike is that it has this silicon bead all around the edge. So the theory is that what happens is this sits up against the outer visor, and that beading keeps it away from the outer visor, so that when you breathe, your hot breath, moist air, hits this and not the outer screen. So this stays warmer than the outer screen. So that reduces the differential in temperature. That means that it's not going to fog as badly. The benefit of this silicon bead, because lots of the cheaper Pinlocks have, or cheaper Pinlock lookalikes have a plastic bead, it doesn't create as good a seal. What happens with the silicon is, over time, it kind of melts into the outer visor. It creates a perfect seal. So that's one of the reasons that Pinlocks are just, in our view, better. The second reason that a Pinlock works is that in this gap between the insert and the external visor, you've trapped a layer of air, but that air is very dry. It is not moist, and the more moist the air, the more condensation. So even though there is a differential in temperature between this and the outer visor, because the air that's trapped inside it is dry, there is less of a propensity for that to condensate and to fog. The third element that makes a Pinlock work, or an anti-fog insert work, is the material itself. Now, the material itself is hydrophilic. That means that it attracts, absorbs and holds on to any moisture inside the helmet. And it does that, it spreads the moisture around the area of the insert, but it doesn't exhibit itself in the way of fogging. So that's really the magic. But therefore, three things. It's held away from the visor, it's got dry air rather than moist air between the insert and the visor, and of course the material of the insert itself. Now, you can, in extreme conditions, overwhelm a Pinlock, and I'm going to come back and talk about how that happens, when that happens, and what you do about it. But a real Pinlock comes in three different levels. You will often see, well, you will always see a number on the side, and that will say 30, 70, or 120. And that's the number of seconds it takes before it starts to fog in their test conditions, in their test laboratory. They are very extreme conditions, nothing like the road, but that's the number of seconds. That doesn't mean that you've got exactly 120 seconds or 2 minutes on the road before it starts to fog. You have way, way longer than that. But what it tells us is that a 120 is better than a 70, and a 70 is better than a 30. So if you really want the ultimate solution, if fogging is a problem for you for whatever reason, try always to go for a 120. It is the best. Helmet makers like Shui would never fit anything other than a 120. So when you're wearing a helmet with a Pinlock visor and it is cold outside, warm air and so on, you can tell when it's doing its job because the main area where the insert is will stay clear, but around the edge it is not unusual for there to be fogging. That does not mean that the Pinlock is not doing its job. It means exactly the opposite. It is doing its job. You're going to get moisture around the outside, but around the main area it should stay dry and clear to see through. So I've got another visor here. We've had it in the fridge again to cool the temperature down. Let's see if the theory works. Okay, so here goes. I'm going to lower it down. I'm going to breathe on it, and hopefully what we will see is condensation fogging on the outer perimeter of the insert. So Grandma couldn't see that, but could you see fogging on the outside?
Yep.
So that shows what I'm talking about. No fogging on the insert itself, but fogging around the outside. Now, if you do lots of riding in wet conditions, if you're commuting every day through the winter, if conditions are very humid, you can reach a situation where over time you've got so much water and moisture has been taken on board by the visor that you've basically saturated it. Now, when that happens, you need to remove the insert from the helmet and dry it out. It's very simple. You take it out, you leave it in a warm and dry place, and then when it's dried out, after maybe 24 or 48 hours, you can put it in. The other thing that you need to do to make sure that the visor is working to its maximum effectiveness is keep it clean. And that's because dust is going to settle. Sometimes road dirt and all kinds of stuff will come up and stick to the inside of the visor, especially if you find yourself in town riding with the visor open. All kinds of detritus can get stuck to the inside of the insert. And what that stuff does, that is also hydrophilic. So we have mentioned that the visor or the insert is hydrophilic. That's good, but dust is going to attract more water, and we don't want it to be more hydrophilic than it needs to be. So what you do to clean the insert, you just wipe it round with a dry microfiber cloth. If it's particularly dirty, you might need to use a wet microfiber cloth, a bit of water on a cloth, and that will just get rid of it. But clearly, if you're putting water on it, you might need it to dry. I have seen people use water running it under the tap, and that's fine. If that's what you need to do to get it clean, then fine. But that just means you need to leave it even longer to dry out. The one thing that you shouldn't do is use chemicals and solutions on the insert. Don't put a spray, don't put an anti-fog spray on it. That's just going to make the situation worse. You will ruin the insert. It will never work again. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to come on and talk about fit and how to fit it, because if a pinlock is not fitted properly, then I'm afraid it just won't work. So now we're going to talk about the fitting and the adjustment of the pinlock visor, or the pinlock insert. So it sits between two pins here. And sometimes you will read about a helmet that doesn't come supplied with a pinlock. It will talk about having a pinlock ready visor. And what that means is the visor comes with these pins that enable you to then buy, as an optional extra, a pinlock visor that will sit between those. And what happens is the visor itself has two cutouts here on either side. It sits between those two pins, creates tension and holds it tight up against the outer visor. Now, a couple of things. When you first take your pinlock out of the box, it will look like that, blue. That's a blue protective coating. It's a polythene coating, and that's meant to just stop you getting fingerprints on the insert. But we have had, quite amusingly, a number of customers who have come to see us having had a helmet for a year or two and said, I'd like a clear pinlock, please, because I do not like the blue tint on mine. You are not meant to ride with that on. You fit it, and then the last thing you do, you pull that off. Now, before you actually fit the insert, you need to give the inside of the visor a good clean, because if there are any finger marks, if there's any road dirt, if there's hairs, you will be looking at that forever and a day. It will drive you crazy. Nobody wants to be taking a pinlock in and out. In fact, you shouldn't take it in and out any more than you need to. So make sure before you fit the pinlock that you give it a good clean. So I'm not using the one with the blue film. There's one that I prepared earlier. So we take this insert and we insert it on one side on the pin, and then on the other side. Okay. Should pretty much always go into the right position, because if you're using the lugs, a pinlock is designed for a particular helmet. It's quite difficult to get it in the wrong position. But that is now where it should be, and it's nice and tight. There's a nice tight seal there. That seal, as I've mentioned, is incredibly important, because if you can get your finger underneath there, if there is a gap, then what's going to happen, your hot breath when you're riding along, your hot breath is going to get between the insert and the visor, and you're just going to have fogging between the insert and the visor. So it's why you need to get tension, and it's got to be held up tight against the outer visor. It's one of the reasons that we really like a proper pinlock as opposed to the cheaper lookalikes, and I mentioned this before. The cheaper lookalikes have a plastic bead, hard bead, and it just doesn't melt into the visor. The silicone of a pinlock kind of molds to the visor. It cements it, it creates a perfect seal. And that's necessary because you do not want any chance of air getting in between. Now, over time, the pinlock is going to need adjusting. It's going to need adjusting for a particular reason. And that is that as you're riding along, let's say it's a cold day, hot breath, your breath is being absorbed into the pinlock. As the pinlock absorbs moisture, it expands. And then when it dries out, when you're not riding or when you're riding in dry conditions, it shrinks. So the Pinlock is continually shrinking and expanding. And eventually, it's going to work itself loose on these pins, that kind of permanent movement. So there comes a point where you're going to have to adjust it. But that's the clever thing about the Pinlock system. The pins are adjustable. They have a shaft that is eccentric, has cams. So as you move them round, they tighten up, and it gives you the ability to tighten the visor. And I'm going to show you how we do that. So, a little trick that Sean here in the shop showed me, having watched me remove lots of pins over the months and seen them flying all over the shop and me crawling all over the floor trying to find them. His method is very simple. You take a spoon, a cloth, you're pushing the pin out from the inside, like that, and like that. Now, Graham will do a close-up shot, but this pin, he will show you how this pin has this eccentric shaft. And as you turn it, that will just tighten the pin lock into place. Now, when you first buy a helmet, the push pin here has an arrow on, and that will be facing towards the center of the helmet, towards the front of the visor. You have 180 degrees worth of adjustment. So if you do find that over time it works loose, you might adjust the arrow 45 degrees, then 90 degrees, and so on, just to tighten it up. One thing on these push pins, some of them have a screw head in, which tempts you, in fact you're meant to use a screwdriver to adjust them. But what we found is, if you're riding a lot and you've been riding in hot conditions, the two plastics kind of melt to one another. It becomes quite difficult to shift, and when you use the screwdriver, it can break. It can break the pin. If that happens, it's not the end of the world. These pins are easily available, but our view is, whether it has a screw head or not, I would always push them out. Ditto the system that Shoei use, because what they've got, every Shoei helmet comes with a special tool. And it's this. And there's a hexagonal head on the inside of the pin, and so on a Shoei, you can adjust it like that. No problem with it, but if you're going to do that, try it very gently. If you find that it doesn't want to move, then push it out, because I can see this over time. If you've left the push pins in place for a couple of years and you put that in and try to adjust it again, it could break. But that's a nice, thoughtful touch. It does make it easier to adjust. You will reach a point, however, where there is no adjustment left, where you've tightened it a little bit, you've tightened it a little bit more, and so there comes a point where the pin lock just needs to be replaced. So there's nothing wrong with the pin lock, but because you have got it wet and it's expanded and shrunk, there comes a point at which it just has no more elasticity left. It is time to get a new pin lock. It's not the end of the world, but that period will depend on how much riding you're doing. If you're commuting every day, if you're the kind of rider who does 15,000, 20,000 miles a year, that might be after a year. But for the average rider, it could be 2-3 years. Some people will never, during the life of their helmet, ever have to adjust or remove the pin lock. So let's summarize. Fogging in a motorcycle helmet is a natural phenomenon. It cannot be avoided in extreme circumstances. It is going to happen. All you can do is manage it. By and large, it is not a warranty issue. So if you buy a helmet and then find that it fogs up, you cannot normally take your helmet back. There are some circumstances in which you might be able to, because you need a helmet to expel the air, to exhaust the air, and if the vents are blocked in your helmet, if they're not flowing air in the way they are meant to, then you may have a case. But normally, fogging comes down to a number of situations that are not the fault of the helmet. It's to do with the heat that you personally are generating, it's to do with the external temperature, it's to do with the humidity of the conditions, the speed you ride at. It could even be down to something like a screen on your motorbike, because if you've got a screen that stops the air coming into your helmet and exhausting it out of the back, that can make the difference between a helmet fogging and not. As I've mentioned, the quieter, better quality helmets tend to be more prone to fogging, so the best quality flip lids from someone like Shoei and Schubert are more prone to fogging, and you just have to accept that. If you want a really quiet helmet that goes with the territory, you are going to need in a helmet like that a top-of-the-range pin lock. Now, the best solution right now is a Pinlock 120 with vents open. So chin vent, air in, brow vent, exhaust the air. In extreme conditions, you may still have to open the visor because that's going to allow an extra blast of air that's going to change the temperature, it's going to get rid of the moisture and so on. My view is that's not the end of the world. It's what, as I've mentioned before, bikers did for many years. Now, in the summer, my opinion is don't even fit the Pinlock. You do not need it because the differential in temperatures is not enough. If you're worried about some fogging, put on an anti-fog coating on the external visor or wash it in fairy liquid. That should be more than enough. And the reason that I think you shouldn't fit the Pinlock in the summer is because it actually reduces the optical quality of the visor. And of course you've got the rim on the outside. So if you don't need it, don't fit it. Now, I'm going to finish by making a point about motorcycling, which is that it's not like wearing a pair of slippers. We're out there in extreme conditions where are traveling at speed, you can get very wet, you can get very hot, you can get very cold. Occasionally, you're going to have to experience some faff. And if that means opening the visor or whatever it is to overcome a problem, I don't think that's the end of the world. I just think it's something that as bikers we have to accept. And if really you cannot accept that you're going to have to do something like that, then you're just going to have to go out and buy a car with a demisting function.